This is part two of the interview with Brandon Smith, and we're going to pick up exactly where we left off in part one. And thank you so much for being here. We certainly appreciate it. Up a video that's produced by RT, or Russia Today. There's a little propaganda piece that says that this channel is funded in whole or in part by the Russian government, but they don't do that for ABC or CBS or CNN or Google or YouTube or any of the others. And it's the exact same thing, right? I mean, if they're taking my labor, my tax dollars, and giving them to one of these entities, then government is funding them. Or am I missing something?
No, there's definitely an unfair double standard for sure. The YouTube's not going to post something from the Washington Post and point out that they're basically run by the CIA through Operation Mockingbird. They're not gonna point that out. There's definitely a double standard, and I think that that's something that ultimately we're not going to solve that problem through government. I think that kind of problem, that kind of massive double standard, and the expansion of that double standard is going to end, very badly. I think
have we reached a tipping point, in your opinion, Brandon? I mean, are we moving as far as the conservative movement? Is that coming to the fore as the radical left begins to wane, or how do you see it? How do you see it happening, playing out right now?
Well, I think my primary concern right now is that conservatives may be too confident in their position at this stage in the game, that they may be too confident that they've gained control of government and that they've gained control of the narrative, and I don't see that as the reality. What I see is that conservatives have gained a margin of social influence over the left in the past 2 or 3 years. And this does not necessarily mean that we've won the fight with the globalists and the banking elites in general, because the banking elites and the globalists have options as far as bringing us down or cutting us down to size if we get a little too arrogant. For example, the Fed right now is actively sabotaging the economy. They're actively setting forward on a controlled demolition of markets, from debt markets to stock markets. And for now, it's slow. But if you look at what they're really doing, they are setting the stage for a collapse of markets and possibly a debt collapse or a currency collapse under Donald Trump's watch. In that process, the concern is, well, who gets the blame when that happens? Will the bankers get the blame, or will they have successfully staged the narrative to where conservatives get the blame, to where so-called populists and nationalists get the blame for that crisis? I think that they've set the stage pretty effectively for us to get the blame. And when such a crisis occurs, people tend to stop thinking logically, and they tend to start looking for the first scapegoat that they can find. So my hope is that conservatives don't get too confident in where we're at now, and that we keep pursuing the fight as far as reducing government, reducing our dependency on foreign entities, and reducing our dependency on central banks. We have to keep fighting that fight. Otherwise, if we start adopting these systems and saying, well, these are ours now, and we can do with them what we want, and then everything collapses, then we get the blame entirely.
Yeah, which we don't want. I mean, we didn't create the situation. And I think, and and when I say we, I mean the American people, or the people, the citizenry of any nation. None of us created this, what we're dealing with. It is the central bankers, and it is the bankers that created the problems that they are making worse. I mean, and if we go back to the late '80s, when we had the S&L problem and the savings and loan issue, and the banks were able to bail them out. And then in 2008, we had the big banks to fail, and the central banks bailed them out. Now we are at the sovereign level, and the only bank left is the IMF, the BIS, and the World Bank, and the alternatives that are in the East, like the AIIB and the BRICS Bank and so forth. So where does it and I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said, Brandon. I think that we are definitely being set up for a collapse, or not. I don't want to use the word collapse, but a shift, an economic shift under Trump's watch. And I think that he's going to be reelected in 2020, and I think that that's when it's going to unfold, is after that time. I mean, and how do you see? Do you have any kind of timeline that you're looking at as far as, or do you think that Trump's going to be reelected? Do you think that what you're seeing is going to play out in the near term, or in the midterm, like I said, sometime after 2020?
Well, Ed, I suppose it depends on what kind of. Generally, the globalists will follow a particular model that they've used in the past, and they're not the most imaginative people. They find something that works, and then they use it over and over again. For example, would be like the false flag tactic.
Yes.
They'll use that over and over and over again, until they run it into the ground and people start sort of questioning, what, this is weird. This is exactly what happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So right now, it appears to me that they're following what I would call the Hoover model with Trump. That and if they are following the Hoover model, because Trump is following he seems to be following a lot of the same sort of policies and the timing of those policies as Herbert Hoover back just before the crash of 1929.
Okay.
And including the tariffs and the trade war and everything else. It's if you compare Herbert Hoover to Donald Trump as policy wise, and the staging of those policies, they're very similar. So if they are following a Hoover model, then there would be quite a considerable market crash sometime by the end of this year, because that's basically what happened with Hoover 2 years into his term, the end of the second year. That was the great crash of 1929, and then the rest is history. We had the Great Depression, so on and so forth. We had World War II, and after Hoover was replaced, we had FDR, who was probably one of the most communist presidents that this country has ever had in the Oval Office. That's my theory, that they're following the Hoover model, that there will be a massive crash going into the end of Donald Trump's first term, and that he will be replaced by a hardcore commie or socialist. Who knows? But possibly Biden. I'm not exactly sure. It could be somebody we haven't even heard of yet. But that's the model I think they're following. I could be wrong. He may win. They may drag it out. He may win a second term, and then they crash the system under his second term.
That's kind of what it looks like to me, is that they're going to push it into a second term. But I believe for a long time they've allowed him to take full responsibility for the economy. You know, I mean, every time he opens his mouth now, it's like, this is my economy, this is my stock market, this is my unemployment, this is mine, mine, mine. Everything is his and his policies. And I think that is part of the plan to let him do that, to say these things and to take full ownership. And it looks like, I mean, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I like Trump. I think he's doing some of the things I think that he's doing. I really appreciate. I think that he is, in fact, trying to do things for the people. I really believe that. You know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just a sucker, but that's how I see it. But I think that I think he's, at the same time, I think he is being played. And I don't think that there's enough time at this point to really crash the market without it being sloppy and, you know, and showing some of the bankers' hand. I think that there would be enough people that would be able to decipher that would be able to get that information out, unless we go back to what we were talking about a minute ago in the clampdown of the internet through Google and Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. I mean, and once again, I think that we've kind of come full circle with how these are interconnected. I mean, or would you agree? I mean, do you think that that's what's going to happen? Or how do you think that these two conversations meld together?
Well, as far as Trump is concerned, and how effective he can be at instituting free market policies, or more libertarian policies, or whatever you want to call them, I think that if that is his intention, then he will have a very hard time doing it, simply because there are so many banking elites within his own cabinet. There's, multiple Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, Council on Foreign Relations people haunting the halls of the White House. He's got too many of these guys over his shoulder, and I see that as a huge detriment. And I don't know how he could accomplish much for liberty when you have those people all around you 24 hours a day. As far as how that connects to, I guess, social media spaces and internet media spaces, I think that the alternative media definitely has quite a bit of influence compared to what we did, say, 5 to 10 years ago. Our influence has expanded massively in that time. Is it enough to convince the general public that that conservatives, populists, whatever you want to call us, whatever name they want to label us, are not responsible for a crash under Trump? I don't know. I think that being in the liberty movement for so long, myself being an alternative economist in the movement for 12 years now, I think we have a tendency to think, or to assume, that a lot of people are privy to the same information that we're privy to, and it's just not so. I think if we're lucky, when all is said and done, and the reset occurs, or the crisis, when all is said and done, if we get 10% of the population, a solid 10% of the population that is aware and privy to all of this information, then we're lucky. I think if we get that many people, then we might be able to hold the line and change things for the better. I don't see us getting much more than that.
Yeah, I think that 10% is required to be able to at least stand our ground. Because if we don't get that, then we don't stand a chance, period. But so I agree with that completely, that we have to. Are we getting that kind of number? I don't think so. I really don't. I think that because you can look at all across the board, and you can see, view counts, who's watching, how many people are watching this video, or how many people have read that article, and so forth. I mean, they're not realistic numbers. I mean, even if you look at something like Zero Hedge, where they get 100,000 reads on an article that's been pinned for a few hours, what does that mean at the end of the day? We're a nation of 320 million people. 100,000 is nothing. That's a drop in the bucket, and it's not 10%. So that's what we need, and I think that I tend to agree with you, Brandon, that the conservative populist movement, liberty movement, kind of overplays our hand as far as realistically how many people we're reaching. I mean, I just don't think that I don't think we have the numbers at this point. I really don't. Sorry to say.
Well, and I will say though that I am actually an I know I don't sound like it at all, but I am actually an optimist as far as our chances for winning this fight in the long term. Um, I think that it's one thing that I've noticed, or one sort of psychological trend, or mass psychological trend that I've noticed, is that whenever the smell of crisis arises, you see a huge spike in numbers on a lot of alternative media sites. And I also think that we've been working long enough. I think we've got the globalists, we've got their number, I think, as far as their general plan. And we've been putting that information out there for years and years now. Some people for decades, but I think most effectively, we've been most effective in the past 10 years. And we've been putting that message out there. And maybe a lot of people hear it and they remain on the fence about it, or they don't necessarily take it too seriously at the time. But when the things we're warning about begin to happen exactly the way that we described, a lot of those people are going to notice, and they're going to say, wait a minute, that's what these guys were saying. This is what these guys were warning about 2 years ago when I saw that goofy website and that conspiracy thing, and I just I cast it aside and dismissed it as nothing, and now it's happening. I'm going to go back and look at what these guys are saying again. So I think that that's one element that neither side can predict. The globalists can't really predict it. We can't really predict it. How many people out there are on the fence who, the seeds have been planted in their minds. They've heard the information, but they're sort of on the fence still. Which side will they go to when the crisis occurs? I think we'll get a lot of people on our side when these things start to develop.
I like it. I like that a lot, and I have to see. This is why I like you so much. This is why I have so much respect for you, because you've thought all the way through that, and you're absolutely right. Whenever there's something that happens, the numbers on across the board on all the websites and video channels, everything spikes. And depending on how severe or what the piece of information is, it can be a huge spike. And I think that just like with what happened in 2016, when the corporate media was saying, "Well, where'd all these people come from?" That voted for Trump. I think that that's probably what's going to happen. That could potentially happen again. If there is a crisis, not if, but when the next major economic crisis unfolds. So I think that you may be onto something once again.
I I would also point out that I do think that this is why the globalists have been so incremental in bringing down various parts of the economy and introducing some of their more subversive propaganda. I think that I really do think that what the things we do influence their timeline to a certain extent. I think if we were not as effective, and if we didn't have as much, if we didn't have any real influence, then the path to the global reset and the new world order would have happened much faster. I think the work that we do causes them to have to adjust over and over and over again, because I think they do know that if we keep calling it, if we keep calling their moves and predicting their moves, and they push forward with the same strategy over and over again, that a lot of people who are on the fence are going to notice. They're going to
Yeah.
see that we were right over and over and over again, and so they've opted for sort of a slower, at least for now, a slower and more incremental path to the global reset. In order to, I think they're trying to avoid proving us right over and over and over again. Maybe that's some hubris on my part or something. Maybe I'm placing too much, importance on what we're doing. But I really do. I really do believe that. I think that they're having to adjust their strategy to us to some extent.
Well, no, I agree, because if you go back and you look at Brzezinski, I mean, he said, and it was 2011. I think it was 2011 in Poland, and in that speech in Poland, when he said it was easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. And there was that speech. If you go back and listen to it, it is unbelievable, some of the things that he said. But he was talking about exactly that, and I think about that speech all the time in the light of what you've just presented, because I think that is a big part of it, is that these pieces that they've put in place, they have to adjust, they have to rework, or well, we were going down path A, but now that's kind of shut down, so we need to kind of move over a little bit and go down A plus or A1. And I think that is very real, as far as what's actually happening, and that's part of why I was saying that I believe that their timeline for creating chaos in Trump's first term is not, they're out of time at this point, and that it's going to happen in the second term, probably the second year, third year, probably the second of his second term, which would fit with what you were saying as far as the Hoover model in the second year of his presidency. It would be his second term, but it would still be in the second year, and I think that's kind of the timeline that I've been looking at.
Sure, sure, and I would say the globalists, they do. I think they do have to remain adaptable to a certain extent.
Yes.
I do think certain things are set in stone for them. So, for example, the market behavior, stock market behavior. I think there is. They do have a time limit on how long they can manipulate markets to the upside, which is why I see the Fed slowly pulling support from stocks. I think that they're hoping to crash the market subversively, in the near term, before they lose control of that whole system entirely, before the fundamentals take over. And eventually the fundamentals and the math do matter. Even with all the manipulation, there's only so much that they can control, and how long they can control it. So I do see them in the process of pulling support from certain sectors of the economy. Now, does that mean that there will be a full on what people call a collapse. I not necessarily. I think it will be more of a an accelerated decline in the general economy that a lot of systems, public systems, and government will remain intact for a while. And I do think that the ultimate crash will be the collapse of the dollar and its world reserve status. And I think that is at least 2 or 3 years down the road, if not longer.
Yeah. How did you go bankrupt? Slowly, then quickly. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. So we're in the slowly part right now, and the quickly is rapidly approaching. But Brandon, I could carry this conversation the rest of the day. I really love talking with you. Like I said earlier, I think that you're brilliant, and your views on what's happening, I think, are based in more reality than anything, because you listen and you pay attention to what these guys are saying and what they're doing and lining the two up, and it makes a huge, huge difference. And we've been speaking with Brandon Smith, and he is the publisher and founder of Alt-Market. And you can find all of Brandon's great work over at alt-market.com. Brandon, thank you so much for all your time today. I certainly appreciate it, and I look forward to speaking with you in the not too distant future.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.